Good morning again. Can you hear me? Somebody say, I can hear you. Say, I can hear you. I want to check and make sure that there's two-way communication. Somebody say, can you hear me? Say, hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So today we're going to move into the narrative of Chinese history. And of course, ultimately, we're focusing on the early modern period, but I'm going to give you a sort of a rundown of the past. And I think in terms of what I was saying last time, one of the features of this account is sort of, we talked about the fact that China identifies itself as a socialist country, and specifically socialist with Chinese characteristics. So we're going to be looking in part at some features of Chinese civilization which sort of connect with the fact that today we find it to be a socialist polity, a socialist country. Of course, we know that Chinese civilization is one of the oldest in the world. It isn't the oldest, but it's very old. And what's remarkable is its continuous history from 2600 BC, a little bit later than Egypt and Mesopotamia. At the time that we begin looking at it, that is to say in the 14th century, looking at it in depth, it had about 85 million people, 85 million people at the end of the 14th century. Now, we know that the first real state in China, was created by a dynasty known as the Shang dynasty. Around 1800 BC is the beginning of the political history of China. And it has more or less a continuous history from that point onwards. During this period and over many subsequent centuries, it was divided between several different states at various times.
2600 BC right now.
And this
Yes.
1500 to present.
26
15 to 18.
We don't do 15 to 18. We do like from the start of
Everything.
history to World War II. Yeah.
Okay, 2600 BC is the beginning of the civilization, and 1800 BC and forward is the beginning of the state or the state system, because for many centuries, from this point onwards, for hundreds and hundreds of years, China was divided between different rival states, and there is a history of ongoing warfare between these states during that whole period. Now, the existence of the state in China promoted the development of history, that is to say, the recording of the main events of each of the kings that ruled China, the big events, the big battles, the big sort of periods in the life of the kings. These began to be recorded from the 11th century onwards. In other words, a historical consciousness began to develop in China from the 11th century onwards, which is, of course, a big contrast with India, where because the state was over the course of Indian history was relatively weak, you do get some history, but it's overshadowed by religious ideology. So in China, trying to contrast, and I think the source of this is the strong state tradition, the strong political tradition in China. Now, an important watershed in the history of China is the Qin and Han dynasties. You'll notice that the Qin dynasty actually lasted a very brief period. It's 20 years. And we're really, for the most part, talking about the Han dynasty. And this is important because it's the period where China finally achieves a more or less permanent political unification. China emerges as a unified state during this period. And last time I made the point that this is paralleled by the full development of the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. I might say about the Qin, the ruling emperor was such a tyrant. He was an extremely clever political leader, and he smashed all rival states and unified China, but he was so oppressive as a ruler that the Qin dynasty was overthrown within 20 years, replaced by the Han dynasty. So we can say that, furthermore, that in terms of, so there's this political unification, but also China, from a ethnic point of view, in terms of its people, overwhelmingly the ethnic identity of the Chinese is what we call Han. The Chinese overwhelmingly are Han. Only 10% of the population are non-Han. Although they play an important part in Chinese history, the greater part of the population is Han. And another very important aspect is that under the Han dynasty, Confucianism, this is the ruling class ideology, the teachings of the philosopher Confucius, become the ruling ideology of the Chinese state already under the Han dynasty. There were other rival ideologies prior to the rise of the Han. There was something called the sort of Chinese legalism was the main rival to Confucianism, but it was ultimately Confucianism which became the dominant ideology from the Han dynasty, became the official ideology, and had an enormous influence, especially on the upper classes of China. And I will talk a little bit more extensively about Confucianism a little bit later in the lecture. Now, following the end of the Han dynasty, we have we're now sort of in the period which parallels the Middle Ages in Europe. We have many different dynasties between the decline of the Han dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty in the 14th century. And of course, it's the Ming Dynasty is important for us because that's where our more intensive study of Chinese civilization begins. So I'm just basically giving you a sort of an overview of what happened between the end of the Han Dynasty and the rise of the Ming Dynasty during the 14th century. And I would say that China presents a big contrast with the West in this respect, because whereas in the West, as you know, the end of the Roman Empire, you have basically the disappearance of centralized government. And the same thing is true, of course, in the case of India, the so-called feudal period in India. But in China, although there were some disruptions, don't get me wrong, there were disruptions. Nevertheless, we have the centralized state persisted right through the Middle Ages in the form of the Tang and the Sung dynasties. China remained a unified state. Although, of course, there were many changes of dynasty during that period. In fact, between the Han Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty, there were 11 different dynasties. That is to say, the families with their genealogy. There were 11 different ruling families between the Han Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. And why were there so many changes? Well, because there were foreign invasions from the north and from the west. There were many sort of intrusions by the sort of people of the grasslands. And we've discussed this earlier in relationship to, say, the Ottoman Empire or even India. Central Asia with its pastoral peoples, with the vast herds of livestock, with its gradual overpopulation of animals and people relative to the resources. The Central Asia during the antiquity and during the into the early modern period, there are these outbursts again and again of these pastoral people into these sort of civilized areas of Eurasia, down into Europe, down into the Near East, down into India, and also China. They're all affected, and China was affected and was always concerned about the possibility of invaders from the West or invaders from the North overrunning China. In fact, they did overrun China at various points. There was that, and there was also the fact that internally there were rebellions, rival families, and often too uprisings on the part of the peasants would lead to general rebellions and the overthrow of dynasties. So that's basically the course of history during the Middle Ages. Are there any questions about what I've said? Now, from the time of the Han, China, the political state in China takes a definitive form, which it keeps right through the Middle Ages and right through the early modern period down into modern times. The structure of government in China is continuous from the Han right until the end of traditional China. The overthrow of the whole imperial system only occurs in the year 1911. So you can imagine, this is an enormously long period of history. And the Chinese are very aware of the continuity of their history. This is absolutely fundamental in terms of the consciousness and the history and culture. The continuous history of Chinese culture is an important aspect of the way the Chinese think of themselves. Now, at the top of the system, of course, just as we see in the Ottoman Empire and in the case of Mughal India, is the emperor. And the emperor in China was regarded as an absolute ruler, unlimited power. There was, of course, there were influential classes in China and so on, but the reality was that the emperor and the state in China were all powerful. The state was, under the emperor, was an authoritarian state led by the emperor. And this was rationalized as basically that there was a kind of unchecked divine right of the ruler to control Chinese society. Of course, in conformity with the Confucian philosophy and certain metaphysical principle. The fundamental idea in China was the emperors enjoyed what they called the mandate of heaven. Somehow, and this is the sort of metaphysical principle I'm talking about. Chinese, the authority of the emperor came from heaven itself. The emperors and the dynasties enjoyed what was called the mandate of heaven. This was the basic idea. As I say, heaven was not clearly defined, but this idea of the mandate of heaven. And that is the way they rationalized changes in these dynasties. I said there were 11 dynasties. Well, when one dynasty fell and another one took its place, people would say in China, the emperor, the dynasty, the ruling dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. And the new emperor, the new dynasty now enjoyed the mandate of heaven. Well, of course, the emperor was absolute, but in order to carry out his commands, in fact, since the Han period, the Chinese created a very powerful bureaucracy. This is a fundamental, under the emperor, a fundamental characteristic of the Chinese political life is this extremely powerful bureaucracy. And of course, what I said at the beginning, we're looking at sort of this from the lens of China today. We do see that, in fact, the power of the leader of the state today, his name is Xi Jinping, is extremely strong, and the bureaucracy of China and the state is also very strong. So there is this continuity. Let's not, I want to qualify that. Of course, imperial China, the China that we're talking about now, is different from communist China. That's obvious. And China has fully entered modernity. Don't get me wrong. But nevertheless, there is this continuity, and it's certainly, especially because the Chinese themselves see this in that light. It's socialism, but socialism with Chinese characteristics. Any questions about what I've said? Okay. Now, this raises the fact that when we look at the other civilizations that we have considered up to this point, we find that organized religion, whether it was Muslim or Christian, or even in the case of the Incas and the Aztecs, played a huge role in these societies. It certainly was under the control of the state, but it was a power in its own right. This is not true. The religion, of course, was quite important in China. In particular, Buddhism, just as Hinduism is important, or in India, and Islam is important in India and the Ottoman Empire. In China, Buddhism was the reigning religion. There also was another religion that we should mention, was Taoism, which is sort of an interesting and distinctive religion all in its own right. I was watching a film the other day. Taoism still enjoys a certain popularity in China. So there was Buddhism and Taoism as religion. But, and I would say that Buddhism during this period, the Tang and the Sung period, did have a certain political influence. But all of that came to an end. And by the time you get to the 12th, 13th, 14th century and onwards, there is a clear separation between the state and religion. Religion is there, it plays its part, but it loses political influence, is what I would say. And the state is all important. So that's a major difference between Chinese civilization and other civilizations. The other aspect of this is the fact that the warriors also do not play a major part in the actual decisions of the state. Now, again, the Chinese army or armies were extremely important. There was a constant problem of the so-called barbarians from the north or from the west intruding into Chinese territory. There was the fact that keeping order in China, particularly keeping the lower classes down, required force. And moreover, from time to time, there were civil wars between the different factions of the ruling class. And so the Chinese were well versed in the arts of warfare. And in fact, the Chinese army was extremely large, larger than anything we see in the West, or even in the previous civilizations we've talked about. Under the Ming Dynasty, for example, the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese army was no less than 2 million men, which is huge, dwarfs anything in the West. I mean, Louis XIV, his army was at most 500,000 men, the Chinese army. So the Chinese knew all about the military. And in fact, it's quite enjoyable if you go on YouTube and you look up Chinese films. They have these great films about the sort of civil wars in China and the role of the military. These films, they're well produced, and the battle scenes are amazing and very entertaining, is what I would say. So China knows all about this. I'll say a little bit more about China and war a little bit later, but the main point I'm making is that the state, the military commanders of these large armies were subordinated to the state. And over most of Chinese history, these military commanders did not play a decisive political role, and neither did religion. So what I'm coming to is the fact that it was the bureaucrats who ran the show. And these bureaucrats were intellectuals. This is the astonishing feature of Chinese traditional society. That is to say, the people who reached real power in China were educated intellectuals from a landed class who are known as the mandarins. The mandarins were the ruler, constituted the bureaucracy of the Chinese state. And these people, as I say, were educated intellectuals. Not only that, in order to become a mandarin, which brought with it huge power and prestige, you had to pass a state examination. This was instituted essentially during the 10th century, during the Song dynasty. State examinations were set up. And there were essentially state schools in all of the provinces of China. And young men, overwhelmingly from the ruling landlord class, would study in these schools, and then they would sit these examinations. And the ones who were successful basically were admitted into the Mandarin class, and they became the officers of the state. They had enormous prestige, and of course, with that went their wealth. And so I would say that one of the features of Chinese culture to this day is the great prestige that intellectuals have in Chinese society. This stems from the fact that power, prestige, status in Chinese society is all rooted in a sort of intellectual or educational success. So that's true in Canadian society, in Western society too, that this is one of the paths to power in Western society. But in China, this is overwhelming. It was in the past, and it's true today. The elite which runs China today, and I'll have more to say about this, essentially you're looking at a class of educated intellectuals, if you like. I'm talking now about the Communist Party. And here we come to the essential similarity between the China of past times and the China of today. It's precisely this sort of intellectual elite which runs the bureaucratic apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state, recruiting according to merit. Now, I know that obviously some families have a leg up and so on, but the system overall, this is the way it works. And so there's this essential continuity. And that had established itself by the end of the Song dynasty in the 10th and 11th century. Are there any questions about what I've said? So this is the sort of setup in China. There's the emperor, there are the Mandarin bureaucrats, and the Mandarin bureaucrats are essentially, with some exceptions, recruited from the landlord class, who basically are the ruling class of China. Of course, the state is above them, but At the local level, it's the landlords who control the peasants. That is the essential setup. Now, this system guaranteed a certain stability and even prosperity over long periods of Chinese history. As a matter of fact, it did, especially notable is the Tang and the Sung period. There was a great deal of scientific and technological innovation during this period. I mean, Europe is in the Dark Ages during this, but in China, there are a lot of invention. There's a certain scientific interest that develops in China during this period. And I would say that this ensured that China would continue to be superior to the West until the 17th and 18th century. Another feature is the importance of markets in China. The importance of China at the local level. Markets are extremely important. Local, regional markets, urban markets, towns and cities, all of that under the bureaucratic state, always under the bureaucratic state. Markets play a huge role in Chinese life. And they continue to play a huge role in Chinese life. That's another feature that one has to take on board. Yes, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, one of its features is that while the state is extremely powerful, while the Communist Party is very powerful, there is this whole life, the market, and so on that goes on. And so this is another feature of a Chinese civilization. Having said that, I also want to say that one of the preoccupations of the Chinese state and of the Mandarin class was to keep control over the market, to keep control over business people, over merchants, to allow them to operate, but to keep them firmly under the control of the landlord class, but also the bureaucracy and the state. Again, notice the continuity, because we see the same tendency in China to this day. Of course, it's all rationalized in China today in terms of the communist ideology, but one has to see the continuity with what went on in the past. So what I'm saying is that a certain middle class did develop in China during these centuries that I'm talking about. And you'll see that certainly under the Ming dynasty and so on. But the Chinese state, the bureaucracy, and the landlord class made sure whenever the middle class began to raise its head, they made sure that they were suppressed. And I would say, I should say right now that one of the features of this is, if you look at Confucius's writings, how this was justified, the fact of the matter is that Confucius ranks the merchant class. I mean, just as we saw in other societies, there's a certain ranking of who are considered the people with the most status, who have middle status, and who have low status. Well, the merchants, in terms of Confucian ideology, are ranked at the bottom. Confucius says these people are unstable and unreliable. They're tricky, and they are unethical. And therefore, he ranks them at the very bottom in terms of their proper status in society. It's an expression, really, of a prejudice which comes above all from the landlord class. Are there any questions? What I'm saying?
So, Professor, so does that mean that the middle class is inherently discriminated against within the Confucianism religion?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Oh, so then they managed to repress them continuously because of how strong Confucianism was.
Yes, but I also want to say that it's there. The middle class is there, but it's suppressed. It's held in constant check by the landlords, Confucian ideology, the bureaucratic state. They distrust the activities of the landlords. They see them as subversive of the proper ordering of Chinese society.
Right. They use the religion to justify other actions against them.
Yes, and I should say that, of course, so what I'm saying that these are basic characters which have a certain continuity and so on, but let's not exaggerate, because at the end of the 19th century, now I'm pushing ahead because it's sort of important for you to know this. At the end of the 19th century, when the imperial system collapsed, capitalism emerged in China. Capitalism did emerge. And the middle class emerged. The imperial system was overthrown in 1911, and the Chinese Republic was declared. And certainly this was greeted with joy by the middle class. But I would say that despite this, and certainly there was a certain development of capitalism after that in 1911. But what happened in China was that, first of all, the new state that was created was quite weak. The landlords continued to be very important in the countryside. They obstructed the full development of the Chinese state, and also they were sort of hostile to capitalists because of their their basic ideology. So that was a constraint. But even more important was imperialism. Western imperialism, Western intrusion into China, and then, of course, above all, Japanese imperialism. And you know that, I'm sure you know that Japan, basically, the West was involved. Virtually all of the European states tried to get a piece of China. And of course, we know about the British in Hong Kong and so on. But the Japanese, above all, they basically invaded, they created mayhem, they tried to exploit China. And one of the things they did was to suppress Chinese capitalism. So I'm saying that imperialism plays a great role in the fact that the middle class fails to fully emerge in China in the 20th century. And that failure prepared the ground for the communist takeover. The Chinese, above all, organized the peasants and assumed power in 1949. So what I'm saying is that the development of the middle class was aborted. The development of capitalism in China was aborted, especially by imperialism, but also by landlordism. And this landlordism goes back to what I'm describing here, this deep Confucian-based hostility to merchant activity, to merchants and so on, and to the activities of the middle class. Further questions that you have? So, one, of course, last thing that needs to be emphasized or re-emphasized, that all of this was done in terms of Confucian ideology. And Confucian ideology was not a religion. It respected religion. It said that religion was a good thing, but religion and politics were separate. Confucianism was based on moral teaching, expressed respect for authority, obedience to parents, obedience to older people, obedience to the government. It was a moral teaching. It was a sort of metaphysical and above all ethical teaching. Nothing to do with religion per se. Although I said that religion is a good thing in society, but it has nothing to do with the state. The upper class, they devoted themselves to sort of rational philosophy of a metaphysical and moral kind. They kept a certain distance from religion. Religion was for the masses, for the common people. Religion played a role. The common people, the masses, basically they were Taoists, they were Buddhists. There was a lot of belief in magical practices. There were also local religious customs. There was ancestor worship. The worship of your ancestors plays a great role in society for the common people. But there was no state religion. That's the way it worked in China. Now, the course, in terms of the teachings of Confucius, of course, Confucius taught in terms of the general good of society. This is what the good of the state, the good of society, the stability of a society based on the family and respect for the family. These were the values. But one should understand that Confucianism was a philosophy espoused by the landlords. And it was the landlords who ruled Chinese society at the local level. The peasants had to pay rent to the landlord, just as in the other societies that we've been looking at. Therefore, we should say that the Chinese state, although it said that it was acting for the benefit of everybody, it above all acted for the benefit of the landlord. And at the local level, the officials of the state, the mandarins, the influential people at the top of society, they all came from the landlord class. This is a whole structure that I've been outlining, which basically is the apparatus of the upper classes in Chinese society. And one could see this reality expressing itself at the local level, because if you look at what was going on in the villages, it is the landlords and the mandarins, the local mandarins, that were the least successful mandarins, had to stay in the villages, of course. This group, plus some rich peasants, basically could own most of the land, own most of the livestock, own most of the agricultural tools, and basically collected rent, exploited the 90% of the people who were below them, that is to say, the middle and lower peasants. The landlords controlled the local government, they controlled the court system, they controlled the Buddhist temples. They were all under the control of this landlord class. That was the way it worked. Any questions about what I've been saying? Now, having said that, I want to speak a little bit about the foreign, the China's relationship with the rest of the world. Well, here we come to a fact that is very important in terms of the history of imperial China and why it ultimately got into trouble. Because China, which was this huge state and very successful state, as I've explained to you, in terms of the attitude of the Chinese elite that we have been discussing, was extremely ethnocentric. The Chinese basically thought of themselves as the center of the cultural, economic life of the world. China was the center of the world. And why did the Chinese think that? They thought that, well, there were no other major rivals to China where they were situated in Asia. Off the coast of China, at some distance, were the Japanese. To the east and south, there were the Koreans. To the south, there were the Vietnamese. Further south and west, there were the Cambodians or the Laotians. That was the world that China knew. So for the Chinese, these small states amounted to very little. Furthermore, in terms of the culture of all of these states, whether it's Vietnam or Korea, etc., they were all offshoots of Chinese civilization. So the Chinese reached the conclusion, well, we're at the center of the world. And that was their essential view of the outside world. And furthermore, this was reinforced by the fact that China was, from an economic point of view, completely self-sufficient. It really didn't need to import anything from the outside world. Its economy was a world unto itself. So, and indeed, many people from outside, from the rest of Asia, and ultimately from Europe, came to China to buy things. Above all, they were interested in Chinese silks, in Chinese porcelain, and ultimately Chinese tea. And they came and they basically offered silver. The Chinese were not interested in gold. Silver was what their hang-up was, for Chinese luxury products. So based on all of this, the Chinese view, well, we're at the center of the world. We don't need anybody. And if we have any relationships with you, we're doing you a favor. We're doing you a favor. That's the, it's not a question of equality between the Japanese and the Chinese or the Koreans. No, basically, if you want any kind of relationship with China, you have to kowtow to China. That is to say, you have to essentially recognize, if you approach the court in Beijing, you have to abase yourself and recognize that you are tributary to China. That was the nature of the foreign relations that China had with the world that it knew. And I'll just end by saying that this view, which one can understand, they thought their system was perfect, the elites, and they were very reluctant to change. But when the West appeared, China ran into serious difficulty. When the West appeared on the shores of China, this ethnocentrism was a fatal flaw. It became a fatal flaw, as we'll see. So see you on Monday.